In 1883, in the southern Chinese province of Guangdong, a young Chinese man named Qin Fan was feeling desperate. Another year of meager crops meant he would be unable to feed his wife and children or even pay his land taxes. He lived in the county of Taishan, and in the last 50 years, Taishan had experienced floods, drought, typhoons, earthquakes, plagues, and clan wars. The future looked bleak. When the Chinese recruiter made an offer for employment in the Western world, it seemed like the only way out.
I knew the next few years would demand much from my family and me. But I promised my wife and my parents I would come home as soon as the railroad is built. With the money I earned, life would be much easier for all of us.
His trip from China to Vancouver Island was an arduous journey. The ships would often take 40 to 60 days to make the crossing, depending on storms and weather. The crowded living conditions on board the ship were abysmal, intensified by the limited food and water, and the fact that the men were forced to stay below, the hatches kept closed at all times. Qin Fan was not alone in his journey. 17,000 Chinese men, the majority from the 4 districts in the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong, set out to find work on the Canadian Pacific Railway from 1881 to 1884. Once in British Columbia, Qin Fan quickly learned to deal with the daily hostility and racism.
We're different because of our clothes and our queue. Our shaved heads and long ponytails makes them suspicious. They hear us speaking Cantonese. They are impatient when we try to say English words, but make mistakes.
When the railroad was complete, few of the Chinese had made enough money to pay for a return passage to China and were forced to search for other employment. They found plenty of seasonal work at one of the 45 canneries in British Columbia, where food and lodgings were included with the job. Chinese bosses recruited their countrymen for the canneries, ensuring the men had basic clothing and food, but paying them less than half the wages of the white cannery workers.
Our lives are not easy. We stand for long hours, cold and wet. I worry every day about my wife and children and my parents. Are they well? Do they have enough to eat? My thoughts make me want to work harder.
Steveston quickly became the busiest fishing port in the world. Each cannery employed from 150 to 200 Chinese, native, and Japanese cannery workers for their production lines.
We have been given a number tag to stick in our hats. Every time we arrive and leave the cannery, a bookkeeper marks down our number. This lets them figure out our daily pay. But the boss Chinaman keeps our wages and will pay us at the end of the canning season.
You are now sitting in the last Chinese bunkhouse, which once housed 75 workers and was relocated here from Knight Inlet by BC Packers. These large, 2-storied, barn-like buildings had rows of rooms with very simple 3-tier bunk beds in each room.
We eat rice, cabbage, and a small amount of salt fish or salt pork 3 times a day when we are working. But the boss seems to think we're less hungry on days where there are no fish to gut and clean. Then we only get breakfast and supper. In the evenings, I stay in the bunkhouse playing mahjong. I do not go to the town like some of the men who spend their time gambling and smoking opium.
Canning salmon was labor-intensive and required many people for a short period of time in July and August. Qin Fan was part of a production process that began at a large open area on the dockside of the cannery. The fish were taken directly from the boat into the building, where hooked instruments were used to sort the sockeye, pink, coho, and chum into different bins.
I was lucky to get work, pressing out tin cans 4 months before the canning started. But now, I'm called a slitter. I cut off the tails and fins, then gut the fish. My sons would think it funny to see their farmer father surrounded by all these fish, which feel and smell so differently from the earth I once held in my hands.
Initially, with a crew of 100 to 150, 700,000 cans could be produced annually. Chinese men were particularly sought after as workers. They were known for their work ethic and impressive skills. Using 16-inch knives, they had the ability to clean and gut 4 to 5 fish a minute. Others chopped the fish into small enough pieces for the cans. The workers did everything on site. After the cans were filled, Chinese cappers soldered lids into place. The cans were cooked, cooled, lacquered to ensure they didn't rust, labeled, and packed into handmade wooden crates. The final product was shipped to ports all over the world.
Sometimes I go Hanwoo grocery store to meet Chinese men from other canneries and hear news of home. On the way there, I like to hear children of the town playing, which lets me think of my sons in happier times. But when the children see me, they run and hide, as though I'm dangerous or not to be trusted.
By 1900, there were more Chinese workers in the canneries than any other ethnic group. At the same time, the head tax on Chinese immigrants increased from $50 to $100, and in 1903 to $500, which meant it was almost impossible for wives and elderly parents to be brought over. The Canadian Chinese community was a bachelor's world.
I borrowed my friend Lee's needle and thread. My wife would laugh at the way I sew.
Things began to change after 1906, when the iron chink was introduced into the canneries. It only took 3 men to operate, and was able to take over the gutting and cleaning jobs originally done by a crew of 30. Also known as the Smith butchering machine, it could process 60 to 70 headless salmon per minute, chopping them into smaller pieces ready for canning. Another blow to the workers came from the Automatic Can Company in New Westminster, which produced 200,000 solderless cans per day, and suddenly the number of canning workers needed for the season diminished considerably. As each canning season ended, Kin Fan and the other workers had few choices regarding the upcoming winter months. Some of the men chose to stay in the unheated bunkhouses until the next canning season, surviving on rice, leftover cabbage, and dried fish.
I will go to Chinatown in Vancouver to look for work in a restaurant. If I'm unlucky there, well, a hungry man is happy to dig ditches for pay. Lee is going to go to Victoria, but I think there is even less hope of winter work there.
In 1913, a misplaced dynamite blast caused a landslide at Hell's Gate, blocking most of the salmon's annual spawning run up the Fraser River Canyon. The dramatic drop in salmon forced many canneries to close, which meant hundreds of cannery jobs were lost over the coming fishing seasons. Then, in 1923, the Canadian government passed the Chinese Immigration Act, which made it almost impossible for anyone from China to immigrate, resulting in many Chinese men staying in the Vancouver and Victoria Chinatowns with little hope of ever seeing their families again. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald had said the Chinese CPR workers were sojourners. Kin Fan knew firsthand the experience of being a sojourner, a temporary resident in a foreign land. He had begun his journey to Canada in the hope of making a better life for his family, but found himself forced by circumstances to stay. He continued to work with one goal in mind, the hope that by next year, or the year after that,
I will have enough money to go home.